key insights, and let's try and find ways for you to get new perspectives that you might not have encountered as part of your journey around FinOps. So this session's all around the inform stage, very much around kind of how do we help empower our CFOs. So I brought my friendly tamed CFO along for the ride to help provide his insights and perspectives as we go through this. Just to get people started with a very quick sort of overview of what is the inform stage, if you haven't yet encountered this before. At its heart, the inform stage of FinOps is really around creating a sort of shared accountability for everyone in the organization to take ownership of the costs of cloud and to create sort of the good patterns of behaviors that you want to see by giving everyone visibility of the costs and in that way kind of driving that responsibility and accountability for the underlying costs. So very much it's about shining a light into your spend and making sure that wastage has nowhere to hide, which obviously everyone who interacts with finance teams will be well aware is something they are particularly good at. So Jamie, if we can start off at the very top level and kind of, can you give us your perspective from your viewpoint and from the board's viewpoint, what is the benefit of FinOps?
So I think this is an area from a finance point of view where the mentality has kind of changed quite a lot over the last few years. Certainly, historically, IT was very much a cost center within an organization. You'd be looking to gain operational leverage off of that cost center simply by the fact of this should only be growing by the rate at which we're growing our people or growing by inflation year on year. Or in worst case, IT would be under pressure to cut its budget year on year. And that is changing in a lot of organizations because IT and IT infrastructure are becoming central to how businesses actually perform and grow. And it depends on the type of business that you're in, how core and central that is to what you're doing. But ultimately, it's about, even if you are not an IT centric organization in that your product is something that is a digital product that you are putting out to market like a SaaS software or something else. You are still in all organizations these days increasing the surface area of what you have in the cloud. More applications, more processes, more data. All of these things are now going into the cloud, and they're going into the cloud for the reasons that it makes you more flexible, more agile, gives you more productivity tools. And as a result of that, it's become increasingly important to really think about how do I optimize my spend? How do I move from having an IT cost center that is just there to keep the lights on to actually leverage that spend? But if I'm going to actually bring all of these toolings into the business, I've got to be wary that as I layer these things on, my cloud costs don't suddenly get out of whack with what I'm doing as a business. And therefore, I need to have proactive ways of starting to measure and evaluate and forecast that spend.
It's funny, actually, because you mentioned that sort of SaaS point of being one of the main sort of, I guess, driving forces of change within technical estate. And I was paraphrasing somewhat of what you actually said there. But I've always felt that a lot of these sort of XOps cultures and things that pop out, like DevOps, for example, as well as FinOps, right? They seem at face value overly targeted on digital native organizations or sort of development houses, product businesses that are, their technology stack is there to support a technical application product outcome that they're selling to customers instead. And actually, the reality of most organizations is not that. We aren't the developers of the applications we rely on in most instances, and kind of going that full whole hog cloud native sort of option isn't actually available to us at all. We can't modernize applications we don't develop and we don't own. And is it something similar to that you guys in sort of the finance world and top-down viewpoints as well experience when it comes down to trying to drive cultural changes, that actually the ideal, the perfect implementation of FinOps is not something that is available to us because we can't make the changes required on a technical level? And how do you factor that into how hard you push towards, ultimately adopting these practices into an organization?
Yeah, I think there's a mix of things in here, because it depends in some instances how well positioned you are as a finance organization to understand and therefore drive change, and versus a finance function that is there to monitor, measure, and challenge, right? And I think the reality of most finance organizations, we are not technical experts. We do not understand technical architectures and infrastructures. We do not understand some of these sort of technical aspects of what our IT teams are doing and why. And therefore, we need to be in a position to really challenge constructively and work in partnership rather than drive and lead. And I think that's the reality for most organizations. So actually, the onus in most instances is for IT to be able to engage with finance, rather than from finance to drive IT. What is critical from a finance perspective, I think, is that we are proactive in trying to understand what is happening to the cost. And then identifying areas for change. Going beyond that, I think the other challenge that sort of non-digitally native organizations that, their own product is not a SaaS product, it's not a product that's in the cloud that they are delivering. One of the challenges that you often face is your IT team is only of a certain size. You only have a certain amount of technical capability, knowledge, experience, and skill within the business. And therefore, pushing your team to do things that are necessarily kind of outside the day-to-day is going to put stress and strain on that team. And for me, therefore, you get into a situation of, well, what is the available opportunity here in terms of cost saving, in terms of efficiency for our organization? What's the best way to access that?
That leads quite nicely, actually, into the one thing we were talking about yesterday, whilst we were prepping for this, around the business case conversation. How do we as technical stakeholders in organizations actually get the best out of communicating and kind of aligning goals and what we're trying to achieve on a technical standpoint to what the organization wants on a financial position and kind of overall business outcome, I suppose. And obviously that ties into one of the points you mentioned in the first sort of question around, in FinOps we call it unit cost economics, right? And changing that from cost center into being a enabler of an outcome. I guess, is there any advice you can give technical people who are probably familiar with working with people, with finance guys on this is the cost sort of conversation, to pivot that into pitching a business case, I suppose, of the spend that you are incurring, and how to not defend something, because that makes it sound like it needs to be defended, but almost reposition how to have that conversation?
Yeah, so from a finance perspective, there are two very important concepts when looking at business case. The first one is ROI, right? What's my return on investment here? How much do I need to spend? What am I going to get back? And obviously, we are going to be very focused on making sure that where we allocate our capital, and for the vast majority of organizations, that capital is scarce. There are only so many projects that can be done, that can be funded at any one time. And what am I going to get back out of that? And I need to prioritize accordingly. So the first thing you need to really focus on is, what is my ROI? The second thing that's really important is payback. So a very high ROI project with a very high upfront cost that may take 2 or 3 years to pay itself back is much harder for someone in finance to greenlight than something that has a much shorter payback period, even if the ROI is lower, because the faster you get to payback, the quicker you can then reinvest that money in the next project. And so the two things that I think purely from a financial perspective need to be focused on are the interplay between ROI on the one hand and payback on the other hand. And if you can demonstrate prioritization of fast payback projects, you can then start to make the case to reinvest those proceeds in some of the perhaps more expensive but higher ROI initiatives that you may want to get done as well. You're on mute, Dom.
Classic. There you go. It's happened at last. Hey. Sorry. So one of the things I forgot to mention, guys, who are watching, please feel free dropping any questions you have into the Q&A. Han is in the background for us, poking us and letting us know if anything comes up that's worth kind of engaging with you guys and responding to. We will make this slightly interactive here and give you an opportunity to ask Jamie as well. But yeah, sorry. Quick note that I've forgotten. Thank you. One of the things that I think organizations as a whole have always struggled with, and I think is coming quite prevalent with the advent of FinOps and DevOps and the world of XOps cultural shift. In FinOps in particular, there is a real drive for shared accountability and kind of pushing that accountability right out to the edge where the workload stakeholders are accountable for the consumption that is generated. Basically holding, saying to marketing, you've got a website that's running on infrastructure, running in our cloud estate, you're responsible for that budget and pushing that out to the sides. How does that work though in a transitionary period where most organizations are very hierarchical? If you look at your budgets, it all rolls upwards very neatly into a straight line up into the board. And suddenly we're saying now we need to distribute this spend out across the organization, and the people on the edges who are directly influencing the workloads are now the ones who have to be conscious of the spend. That to me feels like it should be rough with challenges and issues. Am I right? Is it? Or actually it's quite easy to navigate?
Both the above are true. And it's sort of interesting. Sometimes when you get into these technical areas, I remember sitting in rooms, 10 years ago, and talking to people about digital strategy, and CEOs would frequently sit there and say, well, I've got a great CIO or a great CTO, and that would be their digital strategy. In the same way today that very often when you talk to people about their AI and data strategy, I've hired an exceptional person to do that for me, right? And so part of the challenge of how much do you centralize something versus how much do you empower your teams comes down to how much do you understand about it at the center and how are you educating yourself? And some of the responsibility for that education comes from the experts that you have in your business. And the very best people, in my experience, are people who are good at translating technical concepts in their own area to non-technical people. And so really kind of developing that skill of translating these technical concepts into the core of the organization is going to help them to have a conversation with you. From there, like the trade-off is, as you get into hierarchical organizations, a lot of the desire in those organizations is to prevent people from getting things wrong at the expense of allowing them to move quickly. And that's why these controls and processes and approval limits and all of these other things are put in place. The balance you are always trying to strike in an organization is, I've got a bunch of people here, and for the most part, we make every effort to hire really intelligent, highly skilled, highly capable people. And invest in those people. For the most part, it would be crazy to then not trust those people to make decisions and use their initiative and use their skills and experience for the benefit of the business. And so it's about providing, for me, what are the contexts and the guidelines and the objectives that we are trying to achieve, but allowing the people at the edge, allowing the people closest to the day-to-day with the expertise to actually then drive towards that. Hand in hand with doing that, the key to empowering people is a combination of accountability and transparency. So if you're going to empower people, you have to have a way of aligning those people to goals that are aligned to the organizational objectives, but also the ability to get visibility on what they're doing. What are the results of their actions that they are taking? How do you get those results in real time? How do you challenge? What is the data that you need in order to do that? And how do you judge whether they are performing to expectation, above expectation, if something is going right or something going wrong, so you can course correct as you may need to?
Getting stuck on mute again. Sorry. Turns out I'm not quite as technically native as I thought I was. You've firstly, I think there's so much to pick apart, not pick apart, that sounds wrong, to pull at on that and kind of explore further. I mean, you mentioned AI, and I think that's one of the, I think, prime reasons and drivers right now to kind of get organizational behaviors in place that not so much, I don't look at it from a view of cut costs. I view it very much a case of get yourself in a position to make sure you are spending in the right places instead. And AI, certainly at the moment, is very much, you kind of have to turn the tap on and trust and hope that it's not going to bite you. And it's quite interesting that this ties into a question actually just popped up from Joachim. So I'll just read it out loud and we can dive in, Jamie. Accountant here, can you please speak to the drivers of increasing cloud costs? I understand it's difficult to forecast as your spend. Specifically, are you aware of best practice way of modeling the spend? So I think there's two bits. Our fire alarm works. Good news. So the challenges of doing a webinar in an office on a Tuesday morning, it turns out. From a technical standpoint, Joachim, it is often challenging, even when you are technical and you know the pieces that you're playing with on the board. So to kind of illustrate this a little bit for you and kind of highlight why it's a challenge to give clarity. I mentioned kind of the AI piece is very much like turning on a tap and hoping it doesn't turn around and bite you. That's an evolution on the typical utility challenge of cloud. That was one of the great strengths when the sort of original hyperscalers, predominantly AWS, right, to be completely open about the world, and then later on Microsoft with Azure and GCP coming up. They were founded very much on an idea of scale, flexibility, and utility. And that kind of meant, unfortunately, that in the same way that if you leave a tap running at home, you're just going to pay the water company a bill. The fundamental challenges you've got with deploying a virtual machine to Azure, for example, is you've got a load of bandwidth that goes from your machine to the outside world and to your user. And that incurs a cost based on the amount of transit that goes over Microsoft's network. And you're not in control of who tries to access that VM. Now, whether they can or not, we're not going into the security side of this, but purely if it's open to the internet for you, it's reasonable to assume that someone else could also query across it. And if you talk about a website, which is kind of always my go-to because it's a nice sort of hybrid, everyone can generally relate to kind of the components of it. You put your website out onto Azure and anyone who goes to your domain can access it. You're not in control of how many people go to your website, so you aren't in control of how much traffic is going down those pipes, and therefore you can't predict the costs of it. Now, the good news is obviously bandwidth is relatively cheap on to large scales, so talking thousands of people before you start seeing pennies increasing. But you take that into account, you take storage into account, which is very similar. Storage is one of those universal truths that it only ever gets bigger. You'll never see someone wiping out their backups and starting again each month. They always add onto the pile. And if you probably look at your own desktop, I know I've got files there that I haven't touched in several years. I have no purpose for anymore. I'm not going to delete them, being completely open. You never know. So you've got lots of little factors like that go into why it's hard to predict and model out what the costs of your cloud estate will be. And especially if you scale that out, right? You're talking about one server and one person, interacting with that. There's unpredictability, but we're talking minor percentages on the overall cost. You scale that out over several hundred VMs, and those problems just scale, and you add in additional complexity, and there's other services then playing in which are also utility, and as your storage increases, your backup increases, and all these things kind of combine together into a kind of, it sounds like a perfect storm, but we're talking fairly minor individual increases, but they all add up. And that's kind of the core challenge of cloud, is because of that, the utility model is a feature, it is by design. It does make it hard, which then makes it challenging, right? I often get asked for a PO or to give someone a hard number to raise a PO against a project. And I kind of have to say, well, your finance team are going to have to work in a slightly different way here. I can't tell you the specific cost of this project. I can give you a really solid range, and you would never see it above a certain point, but you're not going to get invoiced by Microsoft a set amount every single month. They're going to charge you what you've used, so a fixed PO doesn't necessarily work. And this pivots nicely for you, Jamie, to kind of give your views from the other side of this desk, where I'm a techie and I'm telling you, I can't be precise about this. I can't tell you exactly what it's going to cost. What do you need to see to kind of help with that modeling position from a business level?
So I very often talk to the teams in our business about trying to be approximately right rather than absolutely wrong, and not trying to over-tune and fine-tune the way that we are trying to predict our numbers. And then I step back from that and I go, what are the drivers of the spend, not in technical terms, but in fundamental underlying reasons? So if you are an organization who's providing a digital service externally, right, the drivers are going to be, what are the volume of inbound requests that you are going to get through your API? And can you predict what that looks like? If it's internal, it might be driven by the number of employees you have, and the access you give them to various cloud-based tools and applications. But if you take it all the way back to understanding the drivers, and then you link the driver to what the spend is. So if it's the cost of licenses to access something multiplied by the number of people, and the number of people are growing because you are investing in increasing your headcount, then you can kind of work out what that's roughly going to look like. If the organization that I was at before Ultima was an AI-based product. It was voice recognition tools, which we integrated into third-party products and allowed people to access our API. Therefore, our Azure costs, because we were in Azure in that environment, our Azure costs were heavily linked to the usage, the volume and type of requests that we got through our API. The flip side, one of the things that we did for our customers, this is also something to think about as you are considering, how do I control or understand my costs? We gave two options for pricing to our customers. One of them was pay a per user license fee. The other one was pay a per request, pay per request, a micro charge. And the trade-off there was a trade-off between certainty of cost and optimization of cost. And some organizations wanted certainty, and to allow their users essentially free access, so that they weren't restricted. So they weren't creating these perverse incentives of saying, please use this tool, but not too much because it will break my budget. And others wanted the flexibility of cost optimization, and only paying for exactly what they use. So there's a number of different things in there. And then the other thing is, as you're kind of targeting your teams, there are what I call KPIs and OKRs, and I differentiate between the two. So KPIs for me are, these are the things that we're always going to monitor just because we want to know, but we're expecting it to kind of bump around within a range. And I'm only really going to care about it if it spikes outside of that range one way or another, but it's always on monitoring. And then OKRs, objectives, key results, those are the levers that I'm trying to pull within the business. Those are the things that I know can influence in a material way the cost or performance of my organization. So it's about understanding what are the levers that are available to me, and from a finance point of view, how do I challenge my team and set leading indicators on how they can best manage their cost, maybe by shifting something from over here to over here. So one for our business, and this is not purely digital, but just as an example of one of the things that we talk about in our business, we provide support desk services, and people on support desk can either phone up someone on our service desk, or interact with a chatbot, or engage with our platform and put their query through our platform. Those things have different costs, and we are able to pull levers to try and direct people in one way rather than another, and ultimately to try and serve through automation, which gives a faster result at lower cost to the client. And so we target those drivers and we set objectives around that mix, because that's the thing that we can control.
I'm conscious of time because you've got 5 minutes, and Blaine's asked a stonker of a question. I think it's going to be a really interesting one to explore. What are your insights on where you think the red lines for governance in a mature FinOps environment, things like risk control practices, etc.? Because right, that can apply, obviously, and does apply into the world of FinOps. But actually, I suppose, general running of an organization, there's always going to be these red lines. And I reckon there's going to be a lot of similarities between what I might say from a FinOps perspective, but actually from yourself, Jamie, and running an organization of any size, let alone 500 people, 600 people, whatever. What are your red lines? What do you think that's likely to be?
So for me on this, I think the equation is changing on this in real time. You only have to look at the number of issues that are coming out around security in the cyberspace to really think about risks to the organization and the costs of those risks. But qualitatively, I look at all of these things on a two-axis matrix of what is the cost of something happening or the impact of something happening, and what is the likelihood of it happening. And if something is obviously highly likely with a very large impact, I'm going to think very, very hard about the level of risk I'm going to accept there. If something is a high impact but low likelihood, to me, that is something where I would say we need a plan to incrementally improve our resilience over time in this area and build our risk mitigation. That is kind of like fundamentally the approach I take. And it's interesting looking at some of the security issues and risks that people have been exposed to, and the amount that they say our company has been underinvested in this space for years. If you cut corners in 1 year, you never catch up on your spend, right? That is just deferred and everything pushes out. And then you've got the stuff which is high likelihood, low impact. And on the high likelihood, low impact stuff, you just need to put in some ground rules. And you just need to make sure at the outset, you've established some protocols and some processes that really reduce the likelihood of those things happening, because 1 or 2 instances is not really going to rock the boat too much, but a constant flow of issues and problems becomes a significant detractor to the organization and to your clients, who then start to perceive or create a perception of your organization based on the frequency that they may be incurring problems.
I think that's exactly as I thought. Actually, there's a lot of parallels in there. I think particularly the point you made around the agility and kind of you take a stance first and foremost, but that's an ever-changing environment. And for me, it's the same with DevOps as well. And I've laboured it to death in the whole XOps movement at the moment around all things cultural and technology. It's about getting the right fit for your business where you are at. And I'm a big fan of the meet people where they're at rather than set a wildly unachievable nirvana goal out there. But I think the agility is really, really important rather than the fixed barriers. So for me, when we explore these sort of things with customers, we're talking about governance, generally, not even specifically around FinOps. Yeah, you can go and arbitrarily go, developers can only access this environment between working hours. It's only got to be in this region. If you try and access it from any other location, they can't do anything. They can only spin up the smallest size instances without complicated approval processes. You can do all those things. It's entirely possible, but you have to look at what you lose when you do that. And sometimes the agility to be able to fix a problem by just hitting with a hammer almost is really valuable to be able to kind of get out of sticky situations. So in the same way that one of the hardest things for me to come to terms with early on in my career was that ISO 27001 is less about being secure and more about being aware of your security risk and your posture. And it's okay to have gaps. If you know about them, you review them and you accept them. Taking those sort of firmer boundaries and saying, I'm okay with removing those, knowing that everyone is aware of them, and accepting that risk, knowing that the worse situations that can be resolved by this can be facilitated easily. But yeah, we're at time and we'll be really respectful of time. We can always book another half-hour session and go over more of the questions we were chatting about yesterday. But thank you everyone for your time. The next session, I don't have the specific date off the top of my head at the moment, sorry. But the next session, we'll be looking around the optimized pillar. Myself and Chris Kirk, head of our data and AI practice, we'll be exploring all things optimization as part of FinOps. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.